Hey guys, this is Mark Hutten with AdultAspergersChat.com, and today I wanted to talk to people on the autism spectrum and take a deep dive into what I believe is the number one reason that you experience more than your fair share of anxiety. So it starts out like this. When you were younger, assuming that you have high-functioning autism, Asperger's syndrome, ASD level 1, we're calling it different things nowadays. It's very possible that since you did have this developmental disorder, that perhaps your social skills and emotional intelligence didn't rise to the level of your peers, and so perhaps you were ostracized, teased, bullied. Maybe you went undiagnosed, and so your parents just assumed you were naturally defiant or more of a reclusive individual that didn't want to participate in family activities. Maybe the teachers viewed you as a bad student. Maybe you got a job at some point and had a hard time getting along with your fellow employees and even your boss. And now as an adult, you're in a relationship and your neurotypical partner may be complaining about your behavior, lack of empathy, and so on. So anyway, it starts out that we did indeed experience a lot of life stressors, okay, from childhood perhaps. So then we start this negative cycle. I'm just going to call it a negative cycle because it goes downhill from this point forward. So after experiencing a few life stressors, you may have adopted a victim mentality. In other words, you just assume that this is how life is. I'm always on the receiving end of bullying, rejection, ridicule, criticism, and so on. And so you just view yourself as a victim of other people and life in general. And so now with this victim mentality, we begin to scan for more bad news. We're a victim. We just assume we're going to continue to be a victim. And when you scan long enough, as you know, you find bad news. You look for trouble or somebody that's going to disagree with you or somebody that's going to be critical of you. You look for that long enough, you will find that person. So now you have scanned for bad news and you have indeed found it. Now that you have found new bad news, so to speak, or a new stressful situation, you tend to over-focus on that situation. So there could have been 10 good things that happened and one bad thing that happened in a day. And you totally ignore the 10 good things and hyper-focus on the one negative thing. And then from over-focusing on it, now you overreact to it. On a scale of 1 to 10, maybe it was a stressor of 4, 10 being bad. But you react to a level 4 stressor as if it were a 10, because now you're getting a cumulative effect of stressors over time, and each stressor, each new stressor, is compounded by previous stressors. So now that I've overreacted to a particular situation or a particular person, and I do this over months and years and years and years, what I end up doing is I turn the event in question into an emotional memory. Think of a time recently when you had a stressful occurrence. Think about it right now. You remember the content, right? You remember what was said, what was done, what the other person said or did. But each time you review that memory, you also have an emotional memory. So you remember what was said and done, but you also remember how you felt during that particular stressful event. So you turn it into an emotional memory. The next thing that happens is, through years of having this negativity bias, we'll call it, you literally sensitize your brain to negativity. In other words, you recognize it quickly, you hyper-focus on it, you react to it negatively, and you also generalize. That's the next step. We generalize. So we've had one incident that happened, and then another incident comes up that's reminiscent of the previous incident, and we think, oh, well, this is going to be the same thing. This is going to turn out badly too. So we just assume that all subsequent events that are even remotely similar to the original stressful event are going to turn out the same way. So now that we are in this state of generalizing, we begin to ignore the positive because the negative occupies more memory space. So you could have 10 things that went well in a day and one bad thing, but we hyper-focus on the one bad thing and totally ignore the other 10 things that were positive. So the next step then is we tend to bring out negativity in others. If you are around somebody who's depressed, it's not long before you're depressed. If you're around somebody who's very angry and resentful, it's not long before you start feeling angry and resentful. Emotions are contagious. And if you have a negative bias, you're going to behave in certain ways at an unconscious level that is going to bring out the negativity in others. When you have a general low-grade negativity and you bring out negativity in others, then you go, see, I knew these people were against me. I knew this was going to turn out badly. So this reinforces our need to scan for more bad news, and the cycle starts all over. So if this cycle sounds reminiscent to you at all, and you feel like you are experiencing more than your fair share of anxiety on a daily basis, you can be assured that that anxiety is coming from a lot of toxic, destructive, negative inner commentary or self-talk. A meltdown can be viewed as consisting of three phases. There's the escalation of anxiety, the explosion of pent-up anxiety, and post-explosion. Together, they make up the meltdown cycle. In this process, the escalation phase is characterized by cues that indicate anxiety is building. Now, these cues can be physical, behavioral, emotional, or cognitive, and they are warning signs or responses to anxiety-provoking events. Events, on the other hand, are situations that occur every day that may lead to escalations of anxiety if effective anxiety control methods are not used. Red flag events are types of situations that are unique to you and that you are especially sensitive to because of past events. And these events can involve internal processes, for example, thinking about situations that were anxiety-provoking in the past, or external processes, for example, experiencing real-life anxiety-provoking situations in the here and now. If the escalation phase is allowed to continue, the explosion phase will follow. Now, the explosion phase is marked by an uncontrollable discharge of anxiety displayed as verbal or physical aggression. Now, this discharge in turn leads to negative consequences, and it's synonymous with the number 10 on an emotional dysregulation meter. You could think of this meter as similar to a thermometer. The final stage of the meltdown cycle is the post-explosion phase, and it's characterized by negative consequences that resulted from the verbal or physical aggression that was displayed during the explosion phase. These consequences could include feelings of guilt, shame, regret, a post-meltdown shutdown. In other words, he explodes and then later on he goes and hibernates and isolates and tries to stay away from people. Separation or divorce, family members and friends that no longer want to be around you, being terminated from a job, and in some cases even going to jail. Now, the intensity, frequency, and duration of anxiety in a meltdown cycle varies among individuals. For example, one person's anxiety may escalate rapidly after a provocative event and within just a few minutes reach the explosion phase. Another's anxiety may escalate slowly but steadily over several hours before reaching the explosion phase. So it will be important to understand your pattern here. In other words, do you go from 1 to 100 miles an hour quickly, or do you creep up from 1 mile an hour to 100 miles an hour over the course of several minutes or even up to an hour? Also, one may experience more episodes of anxiety and progress through the meltdown cycle more often than the other. However, both people, despite differences in how quickly their anxiety escalates and how frequently they experience anxiety, will undergo all three phases of the meltdown cycle. The intensity of anxiety from one person to the next also will be different. One person may engage in more violent behavior than the other in the explosion phase. For example, he might assault someone. The other person may express his anxiety during the explosion phase by shouting at or threatening another person. But regardless of these individual differences, the explosion phase is synonymous with losing control and becoming verbally or physically aggressive, and we call this emotional dysregulation. Another term that is used but doesn't quite capture the severity of this situation is low frustration tolerance. Now, notice that the escalation and explosion phases of the meltdown cycle correspond to the levels on the emotional dysregulation meter. The points below 10 on the meter represent the escalation phase, or the building up of anxiety. The explosion phase, on the other hand, corresponds to 10 on this meter. And it is kind of an imaginary meter at this point. So again, 10 on the meter is the point at which one loses control and expresses anxiety through verbal or physical aggression that leads to negative consequences. One of the primary objectives of anxiety control treatment is to keep from reaching the explosion phase. And this is accomplished by using the emotional dysregulation meter to monitor changes in your anxiety, attending to the cues or warning signs that indicate anxiety is building, and employing the appropriate methods from your anxiety control plan to stop escalation. If the explosion phase is prevented from occurring, the post-explosion phase will not occur and the meltdown cycle will be broken. So if you use your anxiety control plan effectively, your anxiety should ideally reach between a 1 and a 9 on the emotional dysregulation meter. By preventing the explosion phase, which is a 10, you will not experience the same level of negative consequences of the post-explosion phase, and you will then be able to break the destructive cycle. My husband, on the autism spectrum, he has high functioning autism, is very stubborn and is often angry. He also has severe anxiety. Is it possible that the anxiety is causing him to act out in various ways? Well, the short answer to that would be yes, pretty much 100% of the time. A common theme does exist among people with Asperger's and high-functioning autism, specifically their tendency to exhibit both behavioral and cognitive rigidity, which spouses often perceive as stubbornness and being insensitive, selfish, uncaring, narcissistic, and numerous other adjectives. But the behavioral and cognitive rigidity that gets perceived as just rude behavior is definitely a response to anxiety. There's a strong correlation between anxiety and inflexibility, and that can be evident at home, and it also can be evident in the workplace. So a vulnerability to anxiety is definitely an intrinsic feature of Asperger's or high-functioning autism, and that's due to three different things, really. It's due to a specific neurotransmitter system defect. It's also due to a breakdown in circuitry related to extinguishing fear responses. And it's also a secondary consequence of the individual's inability to make appropriate social judgments. So there's numerous factors at play that increase anxiety in people on the autism spectrum. I could spend the next hour talking about that, but I'll try to keep this answer fairly short. A lack of empathy significantly limits skills for autonomous social problem solving. For example, the individual is unaware in many cases that he has said hurtful things or behaved in inappropriate ways. And this results in him, we'll use the example of an NT wife and the husband with autism. This behavior that he exhibits often gets him in trouble with his wife. I work with men on the autism spectrum a lot, and it seems like they all say, yeah, they're in the doghouse, and they feel like they're always in trouble. So this all relates to a lack of empathy, or we will call it a lack of displayed empathy. They have empathy, they just don't necessarily display it. And this limits skills for autonomous social problem solving. Social problem solving, that's an important term to remember. Limitations in generalizing from one situation to another often contribute to in this case, the autistic husband repeating the same social mistakes over and over again. If he gets into a heated argument with his NT wife over a specific problem, and she conveys to him what he needs to do differently next time, he will get it with that specific problem, but if there's a second problem that's just slightly different, he may not necessarily be able to generalize from the first problem to the second problem. Also, another factor that is at play that increases anxiety is the individual's inability to grasp social cues, facial expressions, body language, and so on. So this creates a lot of repeated social errors because he's misinterpreting what is being expressed to him. Social limitations also make it difficult for him to develop coping strategies to soothe himself and to contain difficult emotions. And so those are just a few. There's many more. The circumstances that raise the anxiety level for people on the autism spectrum often result in their increased need to control people, places, and things. This need for control takes the form of rigidity, which is what you were referring to in your question as stubbornness. So there's behavioral rigidity and cognitive rigidity. Behavioral rigidity refers to the person's difficulty in maintaining appropriate behavior in new and unfamiliar situations. Okay? And then there's cognitive rigidity, and this occurs when the individual is unable to consider alternatives to the current situation, alternative viewpoints, or innovative solutions to a problem. People with rigid thinking do tend to view situations in either or terms. It's either right or wrong, good, bad, black, white. They want concrete black and white answers, and the gray areas of life are often very uncomfortable for people with behavioral and cognitive rigidity. Symptoms of rigidity often introduce some of the most disruptive chronic behaviors exhibited by people on the autism spectrum. For example, aggression, difficulties tolerating changes in routine, dislike of changes to plans that have been previously laid out. You may have experienced with your partner on the spectrum his or her meltdowns, frustration, shutdowns, and problems with minor differences in the environment. I get a lot of feedback from NT wives that say they feel that they're always walking on eggshells in an effort to circumvent any extreme reaction from their very brittle Asperger's husband. In addition, the husband himself may articulate his anxiety over fears that things will not go according to plan or that he'll be forced to make changes that he can't handle. Sometimes these behaviors are identified as obsessive compulsive because of the husband's need for ritualized order or non-functional routine. In other words, he has a strong need for sameness. So, as one can easily imagine, behavioral and cognitive rigidity causes many problems in relationships, which usually result in a higher level of anxiety for the person on the autism spectrum. Therefore, this cycle just continues at that point. Since my social intelligence and emotional intelligence is low, I have a hard time reading body language, facial cues, tone of voice, volume of voice, filling in between the lines when somebody's somewhat vague. Since I have this mind blindness issue where I'm not really sure what people's motives are, I'm not really sure what's going on inside of their thinking process, I'm not really sure what they're feeling in their heart, I'm not really sure what they're planning. I have a hard time predicting outcomes based on this misinformation that I'm getting because I have this mind blindness thing. So what ends up happening is I'm always in a state of confusion because I never really totally know what the hell's going on. And I'm like dodging paintballs all day. I'm trying to figure out, okay, what is this person thinking or what are they feeling? Is it my fault? Is it something else? And there's this guesswork that goes on all goddamn day long. And so since you're in a constant state of confusion and guesswork, as you well can imagine, causes a lot of anxiety. Because I never know what the hell's going on. I'm always trying to guess what's going on. So I am literally in a heightened state of anxiety to one degree or another. I'm never not anxious unless I'm engaging in my special interest. But for the most part, I'm in some form of anxiety all day long. What do I do when I'm anxious 24/7? I probably even have anxious dreams. So what do I do in that case? I engage in anxiety reduction. Since I'm anxious all the time, I do as many things as I know how to reduce my anxiety. But I have found in many cases the individual's anxiety reduction techniques at the very best only work temporarily, and in many cases not even temporarily. But in most cases, the anxiety reduction techniques, which would be anger, rage, shutdowns, meltdowns, whatever, I mean, the list is long. Their anxiety reduction technique actually increases the anxiety.
Mark, I have a question, and I'm okay with you adding my voice message and your answer to a public YouTube video. My question is, what's the best way for people with Asperger's to manage their anxiety? Thank you, Ken.
Well, in answer to the question, there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all or a cookie-cutter approach for anxiety, because what causes your anxiety might not cause anxiety for somebody else, and what alleviates your anxiety might not alleviate that anxiety in somebody else. So it's going to be a very individual approach to find out what works best for you. But let's make a distinction between fear and anxiety, because fear is something that you're afraid of, but you know exactly what it is. For example, let's say you hate going to the dentist and you've got to go to the dentist next week, and you know you're going to sit there and get a cavity worked on, and you kind of predict what's going to go on. You already know because you've been there and done it before. So yes, there's some apprehension there, but you know what's going to happen. Anxiety, though, is being afraid of something and you don't know what it is. You just know that you feel anxious, and the anxiety that's going on in the moment is not the event itself, because you don't even know what the event is. It's your self-talk. So we have to look at self-talk. So if the event actually manifests itself in your life, the one that you've been worrying about so much, that actual event will be way less emotionally painful than the worrying about that event prior to the actual occurrence. The actual event is not the source of your anxiety. It's the thinking about the event that is the source of your anxiety. Think of it like this. Let's say you're in college, you've got a big exam coming up, maybe it's the final, and it's super important that you get a good grade on this. And maybe you have some test anxiety, and so you engage in this if-then business. If I freeze up, then I might flunk this test. Or if it's harder than I think, and if I didn't study enough for this test, I may get a bad grade. And if I don't pass this exam, I may flunk the course. And if I flunk the course, I may have to take it again. And if I have to take the course again, then it's going to take longer for me to get my degree. And if it takes longer for me to get my degree, it's going to cost me more money. And if my parents are helping me financially, they may get upset with me for taking longer than expected. And so you get in this if-then loop, a bunch of what-ifs, and that is the anxiety. Another example is there was a lady who had IBS symptoms, and it triggered her anxiety, and so her commute was particularly stressful, so she gets up and she starts having some stomach issues, and then she starts getting sucked into this if-then loop. If I have stomach troubles this morning, then I'm going to have anxiety on the way to work. And if I have anxiety on the way to work, then I'm going to have to stop at a gas station somewhere on an emergency basis. And if I do that, then I'm going to be late for work. And if I'm late for work, then I'm going to get a point. And if I get too many points, I'm going to get fired. And so you're down in this rabbit hole of what ifs. There again, that is the anxiety, not so much the drive to work in and of itself. So you get the point, right? The anxiety is the what-if business. It is the if-then loop that you get sucked into. So what we can do in that case is we can look for triggers to our anxiety and maybe even journal those. It wouldn't necessarily have to be a notebook. It could be one piece of paper. And so after you have an anxiety-provoking event and you're calm, you could write down, okay, what happened right before I got anxious? That is the trigger. And then you would also want to write down what was my self-talk during this anxiety-provoking event. So let's use an example of a husband on the autism spectrum, and his neurotypical wife is upset about something, and so she is asking a lot of questions. Maybe she's saying things like, why can't you ever blah, 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 or why do you always do such and such, or what were you thinking when you didn't follow through with blah, blah, blah. And so she's upset and she's kind of interrogating. And so that is the anxiety-provoking event. And then maybe your self-talk was, oh my God, here we go again, complain, complain, complain. I'm always in trouble. I didn't do anything wrong. Why is she treating me like a child? I feel so criticized. I have to defend myself. I have to prove that she is wrong, etc. So in this example, her complaints about the relationship not going right did download as a trigger for you, but it was the self-talk that exacerbated the anxiety. So what do we want to do? We want to begin the business of practicing different self-talk. So using the example that I just illustrated where she is upset and she's kind of quizzing you, why can't you do this? Why do you always do that? Because she's frustrated and at her wit's end, and you're downloading that as nothing but criticism and put downs and shaming and blaming. So what could you do differently next time in the way of self-talk? Here's some ideas. I could realize that she's quizzing me because the relationship is really important to her. Another thought could be, I'll stay and listen, and then I'll paraphrase back what I heard so I can understand her point. In other words, I'm going to listen to understand rather than listen to mount a defense. Another thought could be, I'll ask what I can do to help rather than just do some version of shut down or meltdown. So we want to replace the negative self-talk that sets us up for the if-then loop with more positive, constructive, and realistic inner dialogue that is more representative of what might actually be going on. So in summary, the best anxiety reduction strategy for you will be for you to identify what types of self-talk you engage in when you're in the throes of a particular anxiety-producing event. And each event will trigger different self-talk. You want to look at those, and you want to begin the process of coming up with some deliberate replacements for the negative self-talk. So that's the key term, deliberate. You will have to start thinking deliberately when you're in the middle of the storm. If you are in a neurodiverse marriage, where one spouse is autistic and the other one is not, and you've been struggling for years and years, and you're kind of sick and tired of the routine, talk to me. Use me as your personal coach. I have groups, and I keep these groups small so that you can get a lot of one-on-one attention. I have 3 Q&A groups, one for ASD husbands, one for neurotypical wives, and I have a couples group where both spouses can attend. I also have 2 instructional groups, Cassandra Syndrome Recovery Group, to help you cultivate some strategies to recover from years of emotional deprivation, and the Men's Masterclass, in which we take a deep dive on developing social skills and emotional literacy in the context of the neurodiverse marriage. We meet 1 hour a week for 4 weeks. These are face-to-face Skype calls. So how much longer are you willing to wait? The links are below in the description area, and also they're pinned in the comments section.